For some reason, tanks are a very contentious topic for a lot of people. Opinions are usually incredibly polarized, with vehicles either being regarded as the best thing ever or the worst thing ever. I don't think this dynamic is exclusive to the tank community, but I do think it's magnified in it. In a lot of ways, it reminds me when people get very passionate about sports. It's not a bad thing to be passionate about a subject, but with tanks it often turns into toxicity, especially if a tank was involved in a war, and even more so if that war was World War II. The German Tiger heavy tank is a perfect example of that. You would be hard pressed to find anyone that hasn't heard of the Tiger, thanks to a number of factors, including a lot of interesting TV documentaries. The Tiger has enjoyed a fairly glamorous reputation up until recently. In the past few years, it's been subjected to pretty fierce counter-jerking. The truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. So just how bad was the Tiger? Let's start from the beginning. The Tiger's beginnings can be traced to the aftermath of the invasion of France. Germany had time to reflect on what happened. While they were successful in outmaneuvering and destroying French forces, their tanks had proved to be not as effective as previously hoped. For most of Germany's tank force, French tanks were hard to penetrate, and they themselves could be easily penetrated. This led to the belief, especially in the mind of a certain mustache man, that Germany needed a heavy breakthrough tank. Armored officers weren't entirely convinced, citing concerns with logistics, but as you can imagine, there wasn't much room for argument. This vehicle would be both heavily armed and armored, being able to dish out as much damage as it could take. In late 1940, the famous automotive engineer Ferdinand Porsche was commissioned to design a chassis for such a tank. In 1941, Henschel was also contracted for a chassis. Frontal armor would be in the ballpark of 100mm, while the sides would be at least 60mm. Two gun designs were proposed by Krupp, the firm in charge of making the tank's turret. Given the choice of a 105 or 88mm cannon, the latter was chosen. In light of increasing penetration requirements, it was thought that the Flak 41 could be used as the main gun, but Porsche was adamant it could not work. With the invasion of the Soviet Union now underway, pressure was mounting on the heavy tank program. The Porsche chassis used two 300 horsepower engines coupled to an electric transmission, which was a pretty novel power plant. Henschel, on the other hand, used an HL210 gasoline engine, rated at 650 horsepower. In head-to-head tests, the Henschel easily beat the Porsche. The Porsche design was simply too complex to be fit for a production vehicle. Eventually it was designated the Panther Kampfwagen 6, or alternatively, the Tiger 1. Originally, 100 vehicles were ordered, but in July of 1942 this was increased to 300. The first production Tiger was completed and tested in May of 1942, with problems being identified in the steering system and brakes. As a consequence of the Tiger's rush development cycle, it had a fair number of deficiencies. The engine was probably the largest problem area. The HL210 had a tendency to overheat, and since the automatic fire extinguishing system was finicky, losing a Tiger to an engine fire was not uncommon. Skilled drivers could mitigate the overheating issue, though the HL210 had other issues. Fuel leaks were also very common, and could also lead to engine fires. Later Tigers used the HL230 engine, though this engine was also very troubled. The HL230 suffered from carburetor backfires, which could ignite fuel or oil that had leaked. The engine was derated in an effort to curb this, but the success of this modification was limited. In online communities, the Tiger's transmission is regularly mocked, but as far as I can tell, the transmission actually didn't cause that much trouble. From what I can gather, the transmission was difficult if not borderline impossible to repair in the field, and as such had to be taken to specialized repair shops away from the front. This would lead to a lower number of available Tigers, and likely contributed towards its reputation. The transmission could also be damaged if the driver wasn't skilled enough, so that likely had an effect as well. Other issues include the heater pumping carbon monoxide into the turret, suspension components taking days to replace, track throwing when turning in reverse, and the front torsion bars bending under load. What contributed the most to the Tiger's unreliability was the lack of spare parts. The Mustache Man's production plan emphasized more tanks over fewer tanks with more spare parts. As you can imagine, this was very counterintuitive. Reliability rates for German tanks were in the toilet across the board, and that didn't improve until much later in the war. As far as the Tiger's combat performance, it is heavily overstated. Tiger crews, and especially SS Tiger crews, had their kill counts heavily inflated for propaganda purposes. The Tiger was also far from invincible. In the few instances where Tigers were encountered, they were taken out by M10s or 75mm M4s. It's a heavy tank that had a few engagements where it got a lot of kills, so people will point to it and say it's the greatest thing ever. The same thing happens with pretty much every heavy tank. So to summarize, the Tiger's reliability issues are overstated, but so is its combat record. It was a perfectly serviceable tank when it was used correctly, which it often wasn't. The vastness of Russia meant that this heavy tank meant for quick, short breakthroughs was now trekking thousands of kilometers. That's a pretty brief summary, but I think it gets the point across. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.